The bobcat's blood dripped from the steel jaws of the trap, its distinctive markings destined for a wealthy collector's sacrificial altar by midnight. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had no idea that freeing this particular animal would unleash ancient forces that would forever blur the line between science and native wisdom, between the human world and the wild. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The Arizona desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Under the merciless summer sun, where temperatures regularly soar past 110 degrees, life hangs in a delicate balance. For a young female bobcat, barely 8 months old, that balance had just tipped against her. Her spotted coat, normally perfect camouflage among the saguaro cacti and mesquite trees, now betrayed her location as she lay motionless in a metal cage, her golden eyes fixed on the approaching humans with a mixture of fear and defiance. Dr. Elena Rodriguez wiped sweat from her brow as she carefully approached the trap. At 36, she had spent over a decade as the lead veterinarian at the Desert Wildlife Sanctuary outside Tucson, but something about this particular rescue felt different. The call had come in at dawn, a local rancher reporting a bobcat caught in one of the traps set out by a neighboring property owner who had lost several chickens to predators in recent weeks. "Easy there," Elena murmured, her voice deliberately soft as she assessed the situation. The bobcat hissed, backing into the corner of the cage, her tail puffed to twice its normal size. Despite her fierce display, Elena could see the animal was exhausted, dehydrated, and frightened. According to the rancher who called it in, the bobcat had likely been trapped for at least 24 hours in the unforgiving desert heat. Behind her, Marco Delgado, the sanctuary's most experienced wildlife technician, prepared the transport carrier. At 52, his weathered face told the story of a lifetime spent in the outdoors, his movements deliberate and efficient as he laid out the equipment they would need. "What's the plan, Doc?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the trapped animal. "Traditional release or bringing her in?" Elena hesitated. Under normal circumstances, they would perform a quick field examination, and if the animal appeared healthy, release it far from human habitation. But something about this bobcat's condition concerned her. The cat's breathing seemed labored, and there was a dullness to her typically alert eyes that suggested more than just exhaustion. "We're taking her in," Elena decided. "She needs fluids at minimum, and I want to do a full workup." What neither Elena nor Marco knew yet was that this wasn't just any bobcat. This was Layla, as she would later be named, and her story was about to become more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. 30 miles away, in a dilapidated compound hidden in the foothills of the Santa Catalina Mountains, Rex Whitaker checked his phone messages with growing irritation. At 48, with a perpetual scowl etched into his leathery face, Rex had built a reputation in certain underground circles as someone who could provide exotic animal parts for traditional medicine and rituals. The bobcat he had trapped on the edge of his property was meant to be the centerpiece of a particularly lucrative transaction scheduled for that evening. "Damn it all to hell," he muttered, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat of his pickup truck. His contact at the neighboring ranch had just informed him that some wildlife do-gooders had shown up and taken the bobcat. Years of careful operation, staying just under the radar of law enforcement, and now this complication. He started the engine with an angry twist of the key. He couldn't afford to let this go. The buyers were flying in from out of state, specifically requesting a young female bobcat for their ceremony. The payment would cover his mortgage for 3 months. More importantly, disappointing these particular clients wasn't an option. They had connections that could make his life very difficult. "Time for Plan B," he muttered, pulling out onto the dirt road that led toward town. He had other contacts, other options. If he couldn't recover the bobcat they took, he'd need to find another, and quickly. Back at the Desert Wildlife Sanctuary, Elena and Marco carefully transferred the sedated Bobcat from the transport carrier onto the examination table. The facility, though modest from the outside, just a converted ranch house with several outbuildings, boasted state-of-the-art veterinary equipment inside, funded by grants and private donations from wildlife enthusiasts across the state. "She's severely dehydrated," Elena noted as she checked the Bobcat's gums. "Start an IV with lactated ringers, please." As Marco prepared the fluids, Elena continued her examination, gently palpating the Bobcat's limbs and abdomen, checking for injuries or abnormalities. When she reached the animal's right front paw, she paused. "Marco, look at this." The technician leaned in closer. Just visible through the fur was an old injury, scarring that suggested the Bobcat had been caught in a trap before, perhaps when she was much younger. "Poor girl's had a rough go of it," Marco said, shaking his head. "Twice trapped in what, less than a year of life?" Elena nodded grimly. "Based on her size and development, she can't be older than 8 or 9 months, still practically a kitten." She continued the examination, finding no other significant injuries but confirming her suspicions about the Bobcat's poor condition. "She's underweight too, probably been struggling to hunt effectively with that old paw injury." As they worked, neither noticed the dusty pickup truck that drove slowly past the sanctuary's entrance, nor the man inside taking careful note of the vehicles in the parking lot and the layout of the buildings. The next morning, Elena arrived early to check on their newest patient. She had spent the previous evening researching the unusual markings she had noticed on the Bobcat, a distinctive pattern of spots on her left flank that formed what almost looked like a figure 8. To her surprise, she found a match in the sanctuary's database. "I don't believe it," she whispered, comparing the photographs. 3 years earlier, the sanctuary had rescued a female Bobcat with a litter of 3 kittens after their den was destroyed by a construction project. One of the kittens had that same distinctive marking. They had released the mother and kittens together once the babies were old enough. Could this be the same animal? The coincidence seemed too great, but wildlife often remained in their home territories throughout their lives. If this was indeed one of those kittens, now grown, it meant she had survived on her own for several years before running into trouble again. Elena's thoughts were interrupted by the sanctuary's security system chiming as the front door opened. Marco arrived with coffee in hand, looking as if he hadn't slept well. "You're not going to believe this," Elena said by way of greeting. "Remember that family of Bobcats from the Silver Bell construction site rescue? I think our patient is one of those kittens." Marco's eyebrows rose as he examined the photos. "Well, I'll be damned. Talk about coming full circle." He handed Elena one of the coffee cups. "Speaking of circles, I did some asking around last night. That trap wasn't set by the rancher who called us. Word is, it was Rex Whitaker's land." Elena's expression darkened. "Whitaker? The same guy Fish and Wildlife has been trying to build a case against for illegal wildlife trafficking?" "One and the same," Marco confirmed. "And the timing's interesting. There's whispers he's got some kind of big sale happening, exotic animal parts for some ritual or ceremony." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. They both knew there was a black market for wildlife parts. Bobcat bones and organs were sometimes used in certain traditional practices. If Whitaker had trapped this Bobcat deliberately for such a purpose, then the animal had escaped more than just a day in the hot sun. She had escaped being killed. "We need to call Fish and Wildlife," Elena said, reaching for her phone. "Already did," Marco replied. "They're sending someone over this morning to take a statement, but they warned me they don't have enough for a warrant yet. They've been after this guy for years." Elena's jaw set in determination. "Then we need to make sure this Bobcat stays safe until they can build their case. And we need to document everything, every injury, every finding." As they talked, the bobcat in question was beginning to stir in her enclosure. The fluids had done their job, bringing her back from the brink of severe dehydration. Her golden eyes, clearer now than when they had found her, tracked the human's movements through the viewing window with cautious interest. "We need a name for her," Elena said, watching the bobcat's renewed alertness with satisfaction. "For the records." Marco studied the animal thoughtfully. "How about Layla? Means night in Arabic. Seems fitting for a survivor who's seen some dark times." "Layla it is," Elena agreed, making a note in the file. Neither of them could have predicted just how apt that name would prove to be, nor the darkness that would come looking for Layla before the week was out. The bobcat's journey had only just begun, and the humans who had saved her would soon find themselves drawn into a dangerous game of cat and mouse with a man who wouldn't easily give up his prize. Outside the sanctuary, as the morning sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, Rex Whitaker sat in his truck, watching and waiting. The call he had just received confirmed his suspicions. His bobcat was inside. Now he just needed a plan to get her back. Too much money was at stake to walk away, and his reputation in certain circles depended on delivering what he had promised. "Enjoy your stay, Kitty," he muttered, starting the engine. "It won't be for long." Over the next 48 hours, Layla's condition improved dramatically. Elena monitored her progress with growing optimism, noting how the bobcat's natural strength and resilience had helped her bounce back from near disaster. By the second morning, Layla was pacing her enclosure with purpose, those golden eyes now bright and alert, tracking every movement beyond the viewing glass with the intense focus characteristic of her species. "She's ready for the outdoor recovery habitat," Elena told Marco as they observed the bobcat's restless energy. The sanctuary included several large naturalistic enclosures where animals could regain their strength in an environment that mimicked their natural habitat while still remaining under observation. Marco nodded in agreement. "The sooner she gets some space to move, the better. That old paw injury doesn't seem to be slowing her down much." They carefully prepared for the transfer, following well-established protocols developed through years of wildlife rehabilitation work. Safety was paramount, both for the humans and for Layla herself. Despite her improved condition, she remained a wild predator, unpredictable and dangerous if mishandled. "Fish and Wildlife called this morning," Marco mentioned as they worked. "Agent Vasquez is stopping by around noon. Sounds like they're taking the Whitaker connection seriously." Elena felt a surge of satisfaction. Perhaps this time they would finally gather enough evidence to stop the man who had been a shadow over the region's wildlife for far too long. "Good. I've prepared all our documentation on Layla's condition when she arrived. The trap location, everything." Once they had Layla settled in the outdoor recovery habitat, a spacious enclosure with desert vegetation, rocks for climbing, and several sheltered dens, Elena returned to her office to prepare for the meeting with the federal agent. She pulled up the sanctuary's records on the previous bobcat family rescue, confirming her suspicions about Layla's identity. The distinctive marking was unmistakable. This was indeed one of the kittens they had saved 3 years earlier. Elena found herself wondering about the mother and the other 2 kittens. Had they survived? Had they thrived in the wilderness that was increasingly encroached upon by human development? The thought reminded her of why she had dedicated her life to this work. Each animal they saved represented a small victory in the larger battle to preserve the delicate balance of the desert ecosystem. At precisely noon, a government-issued SUV pulled up to the sanctuary. Special Agent Carmen Vasquez stepped out, her crisp khaki uniform and confident stride marking her as someone who commanded respect. At 45, she had spent 2 decades with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the last 8 focused on wildlife trafficking cases in the Southwest. "Dr. Rodriguez," she greeted Elena with a firm handshake. "I understand you've had an encounter with our person of interest." Elena led Agent Vasquez to her office where Marco joined them. For the next hour, they detailed everything they knew about the trapped Bobcat, the location where she was found, and their suspicions about Rex Whitaker's involvement. "We've been building a case against Whitaker for years," Vasquez explained, reviewing the documentation Elena had prepared. "The problem is, he's careful. Keeps his actual sales and exchanges away from his property, uses intermediaries for most communications." She looked up from the papers. "This Bobcat might be our best opportunity yet to catch him in the act." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, a note of concern in her voice. "My sources tell me Whitaker had a buyer lined up for a specific transaction, one requiring a young female Bobcat. The timing matches perfectly with when your Layla was trapped." Vasquez tapped her pen against the desk thoughtfully. "The buyer is supposedly still in town, waiting for Whitaker to deliver." Marco leaned forward. "So you think he might try to get her back? Or trap another one?" "Both are possibilities we need to consider," Vasquez confirmed. "We've had surveillance on his known properties, but he's been lying low since the trap was discovered. That concerns me." A cold feeling settled in Elena's stomach. The sanctuary had dealt with attempted animal thefts before. Exotic birds and reptiles were particularly targeted, but the idea that someone might try to reclaim Layla for such a grim purpose made her blood boil. "We have security cameras and an alarm system," she said, "but we're not exactly Fort Knox. We're a non-profit running on grants and donations." Vasquez nodded understanding. "I can arrange for additional patrols in the area for the next few days, but I can't post a full-time guard without more concrete evidence." She hesitated, then added, "There's another option we should discuss. We could use the Bobcat as bait in a controlled operation." "Absolutely not," Elena said immediately, her voice sharp. "Layla has already been traumatized enough. I won't put her at further risk." "I understand your concern, Doctor," Vasquez replied evenly. "But consider the bigger picture. If we catch Whitaker in the act, we can shut down his entire operation. Think of how many animals that would save." The tension in the room thickened. Marco, who had remained quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. "What exactly would this operation involve?" As Vasquez outlined her proposal, Elena found herself torn between her duty to protect the animal in her care and the opportunity to stop a man who had harmed countless others. The plan wasn't without merit. A carefully controlled sting operation with Layla, secured in a specially monitored enclosure, never actually at risk of being taken. But the very idea of using a recovering animal as a lure in a law enforcement operation went against everything Elena believed in as a veterinarian. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "Layla's welfare has to be my primary concern." Vasquez accepted this with a professional nod. "Of course, but don't take too long. If Whitaker can't get this Bobcat back, he'll simply trap another one. The demand isn't going away just because this particular animal escaped." After the agent left, Elena went to check on Layla. The Bobcat had settled into her new enclosure, currently resting on a flat rock in a patch of sunlight, her spotted coat blending remarkably well with the dappled shadows. Looking at her now, so peaceful yet alert, Elena felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. "What's the right thing to do, Layla?" she whispered. As if in response, the Bobcat's ears swiveled toward her, those golden eyes fixing on Elena with an intensity that seemed almost knowing. For a wild animal that had every reason to fear humans, Layla showed remarkable composure in their presence. Perhaps she retained some memory of the sanctuary from her kittenhood, some understanding that this place meant safety. Meanwhile, Rex Whitaker was growing desperate. His buyers, a pair of wealthy collectors from the East Coast who dealt in black market animal parts for their private clientele, had given him an ultimatum: deliver the young female Bobcat by the weekend, or the deal was off. Their specific requirements, a bobcat of particular age and gender for a ceremony that supposedly could only be performed during the full moon, left him little room to maneuver. He had spent the past 2 days scouting the sanctuary, noting staff schedules and security measures. The operation was smaller than he had initially feared, with only a handful of full-time employees and volunteers who came and went during daylight hours. After dark, the place was typically deserted except for a basic alarm system he was confident he could bypass. This would be so much easier if they'd just mind their own business, he muttered to himself as he marked the location of security cameras on a rough sketch of the property. Wildlife do-gooders had been a thorn in his side for years, but he'd never directly confronted them before. His business operated best in the shadows, away from attention. But the payout for this job was too significant to walk away from, and his reputation among certain collectors would suffer irreparable damage if he failed to deliver. Beyond that, there was a principle at stake. The bobcat had been taken from his trap on the edge of his property. In Rex's mind, that made the animal rightfully his. As the sun began to set over the desert, casting long shadows across the sanctuary grounds, both Elena and Rex were making decisions that would set them on a collision course, with Layla caught in the middle. Elena sat in her office weighing Agent Vasquez's proposal against her own ethical obligations. Rex sat in his truck a mile away, reviewing his plan for a midnight infiltration of the sanctuary. Neither realized that a third party was about to enter the equation, one whose interest in the bobcat was more personal and far more ancient than either could imagine. In the hills beyond the sanctuary, an elderly man of Tohono O'odham descent watched the facility through binoculars. James Antone, or Old Jim as the younger generation called him, had been tracking this particular bobcat since her birth. The distinctive marking on her flank wasn't just a random pattern to him, it was a sign, one his grandmother had taught him to recognize decades ago. "So they found you again, little sister," he murmured, lowering the binoculars. The bobcat the scientists called Layla had a different name in his tradition, one that connected her to stories that had been passed down through countless generations, and if his suspicions were correct, the danger she faced was far greater than anyone at the sanctuary could possibly understand. Night fell over the desert like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the distinctive symphony of nocturnal creatures. Coyotes called to one another across the arroyos, their haunting yips echoing through the darkness. Nighthawks swooped silently overhead, hunting insects drawn to the sanctuary's exterior lights. And in her enclosure, Layla became more active, her natural rhythms responding to the changing world around her. Elena had decided to stay late, partly to monitor Layla's first night in the outdoor habitat, and partly because her conversation with Agent Vasquez had left her too restless to go home. She sat in the small observation blind adjacent to the enclosure, the space designed to allow staff to observe animals without being seen themselves. Through the one-way glass, she watched as Layla methodically explored every corner of her temporary home, her movements fluid and purposeful, despite the old injury to her paw. "You're quite the survivor, aren't you?" Elena murmured, making notes on her tablet as she documented the bobcat's behavior. Contrary to her expectations, Layla showed no signs of stress in the new environment. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than she had in the indoor recovery area, her natural instincts responding positively to the open sky and natural substrate beneath her paws. A soft knock on the blind's door startled her. Marco entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a concerned expression. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her one of the cups. "You planning on camping out here all night?" Elena accepted the coffee gratefully. "Just for a few more hours. I want to make sure she settles in properly." She paused, watching as Layla scaled a small boulder with effortless grace. "Have you decided what you think about Vasquez's proposal?" Marco took the seat beside her, his eyes following the Bobcat's movements. "I'm torn, same as you. The operation could do a lot of good if it works." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "But using Layla as bait, even if she's never in real danger, it doesn't sit right." "Exactly," Elena agreed. "And there's something else." She hesitated, uncertain how to express the feeling that had been growing since they'd identified Layla as one of the kittens from the previous rescue. "I can't shake the sense that there's something special about her, the way she's survived, the fact that our paths have crossed twice now." Marco nodded slowly. "I know what you mean. I'm not usually one for mystical thinking, but sometimes an animal comes along that just seems different." He smiled slightly. "My grandmother would say Layla has a strong spirit guide watching over her." Elena returned the smile, appreciating Marco's understanding. His heritage, a blend of Mexican and Tohono O'odham ancestry, gave him a perspective that bridged the scientific world where they both worked and the traditional knowledge of the desert that had been passed down through generations. "Maybe your grandmother's right," she said. "Either way, I've made my decision. I'm going to call Vasquez in the morning and tell her we can't use Layla in the operation. We'll find another way to help them build their case against Whitaker." As they sat in companionable silence watching Layla continue her exploration, neither was aware of the figure moving through the darkness beyond the sanctuary's perimeter fence. James Antone moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in the desert, his footsteps nearly silent on the sandy soil. At 72, he remained as connected to this land as he had been in his youth, reading its signs and secrets with practiced ease. He paused at the edge of the property, his weathered hands resting on the chain-link fence as he surveyed the sanctuary buildings. Lights still burned in a few windows, indicating the presence of staff members working late. This complicated matters, but not insurmountably. He had not come to interfere with their work. In fact, he respected what they did here. But he needed to see the Bobcat for himself, to confirm what he suspected. With careful movements that belied his age, James made his way along the fence line until he reached a point where he could see the outdoor enclosures. His eyes, still sharp despite the years, quickly located the Bobcat habitat. And there she was, the one his people called Tohill, the Firebringer. The distinctive marking on her flank gleamed in the moonlight as she moved, confirming what James had suspected. According to the stories his grandmother had shared, a bobcat bearing this mark appeared only once in a generation, a messenger between the human and animal worlds during times of significance. His grandmother had seen one in her youth, before the Great Drought of the 1950s. And now, in his twilight years, James was witnessing another. The appearance of Tohill was both an honor and a warning. Something was coming, a change, a challenge, a choice that would affect the balance between humans and the natural world. James had been tracking signs for months: unusual migration patterns, changes in plant flowering times, whispers among the elders about dreams filled with fire and water. And now, the final confirmation stood before him, contained within a human-made enclosure of steel and wire. Meanwhile, Rex Whitaker had arrived at his predetermined observation point, a quarter-mile from the sanctuary. Through his night vision binoculars, he noted with frustration that there were still people inside the main building. His plan had been predicated on entering after all staff had left for the night. "Damn dedicated animal lovers," he muttered, checking his watch. It was already past 10, much later than the sanctuary typically remained open. He would need to adapt his strategy, perhaps delay until after midnight, when surely even the most committed employee would have gone home. As he waited, Rex reviewed the equipment in his backpack: bolt cutters for the fence, a specialized animal transport carrier, sedative darts in case the Bobcat proved difficult to handle, and a signal jammer to disable the security system. He had done his homework, identifying the make and model of the sanctuary's alarm through careful observation and a strategic phone call, posing as a security consultant. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was going to such lengths for a single Bobcat when there were plenty in the wild. But his buyers had been specific. They wanted a young female, preferably one that had already demonstrated resilience. Something about the energy being stronger in an animal that had survived hardship. Rex didn't pretend to understand the mystical mumbo-jumbo. He only cared about the substantial payment that would be transferred to his offshore account upon delivery. Back in the observation blind, Elena's phone chimed with a text message. She glanced at the screen, frowning slightly. "Everything okay?" Marco asked. "It's from Vasquez," Elena replied, reading the message. "They've picked up some chatter suggesting Whitaker might make a move tonight. She's sending a patrol car to drive by every hour or so, but they don't have the manpower for continuous surveillance." Marco straightened in his chair. "I can stay overnight. Set up a cot in the break room." Elena hesitated, then nodded. "I'll stay too. We can take shifts." She looked back at Layla, who had finally settled into one of the sheltered dens, though her alert eyes remained fixed on the world outside. "I'd never forgive myself if something happened to her on my watch." They set about preparing for an unexpected night at the sanctuary, unaware that they were being observed by not one but two sets of eyes, one with intentions to take the Bobcat, the other with purposes far more complex and ancient. James Antone watched the activity around the buildings with patient interest. The increased human presence was an unexpected complication, but not an insurmountable one. He hadn't planned to make contact with the sanctuary staff tonight, but perhaps circumstances were guiding him toward a different approach than he had initially envisioned. In traditional teachings, when one sought wisdom from Tohil, one did not dictate the terms of the encounter. The messenger chose the path, and humans were meant to follow with open hearts and minds. If direct observation was being made difficult, perhaps he was meant to speak with these scientists who had taken the Bobcat into their care. Decision made, James began making his way toward the front entrance of the sanctuary, his gait unhurried but purposeful. Whatever was coming, whatever change Tohil's appearance heralded, it seemed the next chapter would involve these well-meaning people who thought they were simply caring for an injured wild animal, unaware of the ancient significance she carried in her distinctive markings and golden eyes. In her enclosure, Layla suddenly lifted her head, her attention focused on something beyond the fence. Her ears swiveled forward, catching sounds too faint for human perception. She rose to her feet in one fluid motion, moving to the edge of the habitat closest to the main gate. There she stood, perfectly still except for the slight twitch of her tail tip, her gaze fixed on the darkness as if awaiting the arrival of something or someone she somehow expected. The sanctuary's front gate was secured with a heavy padlock after hours, a simple but effective deterrent for casual trespassers. Elena and Marco had just finished setting up their makeshift overnight arrangements in the break room when the security system chimed, indicating motion at the perimeter fence. They exchanged concerned glances before moving quickly to the surveillance monitor mounted on the wall. "Southeast corner," Marco said, pointing to the camera feed that showed a solitary figure standing calmly by the fence. "Doesn't look like he's trying to break in. Just standing there." Elena squinted at the grainy night vision image. The man appeared elderly, dressed in practical outdoor clothing with long silver hair pulled back in a traditional style. "He doesn't fit the profile of Whitaker or any of his known associates," she said, recalling the photos Agent Vasquez had shared. "Want me to call it in?" Marco asked, already reaching for his phone. Elena hesitated, studying the figure on the screen. There was something about his demeanor, the way he stood so calmly, making no attempt to conceal himself, that didn't suggest threat. "Let's check it out first," He might just be a local who's concerned about something. They made their way outside, flashlights in hand, with Marco discreetly carrying the tranquilizer gun they kept for emergencies. As they approached the fence, the elderly man raised a hand in greeting, his weathered face serene in the beam of their lights. "Good evening," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "I apologize for disturbing you at this hour. My name is James Antone. I've come about the Bobcat you rescued." Elena and Marco exchanged puzzled glances. News of animal rescues occasionally generated public interest, but rarely prompted nighttime visits. "How did you know about the Bobcat?" Elena asked, maintaining a cautious distance from the fence. James smiled gently. "I've been tracking her for some time. She is known to my people as Tohill, the Firebringer." Something in his tone, a quiet certainty that carried no hint of deception, prompted Elena to make a decision. "Mr. Antone, if you'll go around to the main entrance, we can continue this conversation more comfortably." Minutes later, they were seated in Elena's office, the sanctuary's security system temporarily reset after admitting their unusual visitor. Up close, James Antone had a dignified presence that commanded respect despite his simple attire and unassuming manner. Elena estimated he must be in his 70s, but his eyes were sharp and clear, missing nothing as they took in the details of the room. "You're Tohono o Autumn?" Marco asked, recognition in his voice. James nodded. "Yes. My mother's people have lived in this desert for thousands of years." He turned to Elena. "Dr. Rodriguez, I understand you're concerned about why I'm here. Let me assure you I mean no harm to the Bobcat you call Layla, quite the opposite." "How do you know her name?" Elena asked, her scientific skepticism warring with an instinctive sense that this man was trustworthy. "I heard it spoken by your colleague earlier when I was observing," James admitted with a small smile. "But I've known of her existence since she was born. The marking she bears, the one you've documented in your records, has significance in our traditions." Marco leaned forward, interest overcoming his initial wariness. "What kind of significance?" James folded his hands in his lap, gathering his thoughts. "In the stories passed down through generations, bobcats with this marking appear only once in a lifetime, during periods of great change or challenge. They are messengers, bridges between the human and animal worlds." He looked directly at Elena. "My grandmother saw one before the great drought of the 1950s. Now I have seen Tohill in my twilight years." Elena felt a mixture of fascination and professional skepticism. Her scientific training made her wary of attributing mystical significance to natural phenomena, yet there was something compelling about James's quiet certainty. "The marking is just a variation in coat pattern," she said gently. "Many bobcats have distinctive spots." James nodded, accepting her perspective without offense. "Science has its explanations, and they are valid in their way. But some truths exist alongside your measurements and classifications, Dr. Rodriguez. May I see her?" The request was simple but loaded with implications. Allowing a stranger access to a recovering animal went against protocols. Yet Elena found herself considering it seriously. "Why is tonight so important?" she asked instead. "You could have come during regular hours." "Because tonight she is in danger," James replied simply. "And not just from the man who waits in the darkness to take her." Elena and Marco exchanged alarmed glances. "You've seen someone else out there?" Marco asked sharply. "A man in a truck watching. He has been there since sunset." James's expression remained calm despite the ominous nature of his words. "But the greater danger comes from what Tohill represents. The ceremony some wish to use her for is a perversion of ancient practices, a misunderstanding of her true purpose." While this conversation unfolded, Rex Whitaker was growing increasingly impatient. The arrival of the old man had further complicated his plans, adding another variable he hadn't anticipated. Through his binoculars, he had watched the man being escorted inside, cursing under his breath at the delay. "Just my luck," he muttered. "Probably some animal rights activist or volunteer." The buyers had called again, their thinly veiled impatience fueling his determination. They had extended their deadline by just 24 hours. After that, the phase of the moon would be wrong for their purposes, whatever those might be. Rex didn't care about the specifics, only that failure would cost him not just this payday, but potentially future business as well. He checked his watch again, 11:42 p.m. With the sanctuary now alert to a potential threat, his original plan was increasingly risky, but he had not survived in this business for 2 decades by being inflexible. There was more than one way to acquire an animal, and he always had contingency plans. Back inside the sanctuary, Elena had made her decision. "I'll allow you to see Layla, Mr. Antone, but I'll be with you the entire time, and at the first sign of distress from her, we leave immediately." James inclined his head in acceptance of these terms. "Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. That is fair." The three made their way through the quiet building toward the outdoor enclosures. The night had deepened, the desert sky ablaze with stars in the absence of city lights. As they approached Layla's habitat, Elena was surprised to see the bobcat alert and watching as if she had been expecting them. "She's unusually active for this time of night," Marco observed. "Most of our rehabilitation animals take longer to adjust to new surroundings." James said nothing, but a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. When they reached the viewing area adjacent to the enclosure, he moved forward slowly, his eyes never leaving the bobcat. Layla, in turn, fixed her gaze on him with an intensity that made Elena catch her breath. There was a recognition there that defied explanation. "Hello, little sister," James said softly in his native language. "I have come as the stories said I would." To Elena's astonishment, Layla approached the edge of the enclosure closest to where James stood. The bobcat's body language showed none of the wariness she typically displayed around humans. Instead, she sat calmly, her tail wrapped around her paws, watching James with those intelligent golden eyes. "This is unusual behavior," Elena murmured, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. "She knows why I'm here," James replied, his voice low and reverent. "The danger that approaches is one she has sensed already." "What danger exactly?" Marco asked, glancing nervously toward the perimeter fence barely visible in the darkness beyond. Before James could answer, the lights throughout the sanctuary suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the starlight filtering through the skylights. The familiar hum of the security system fell silent at the same moment. "Power cut," Marco whispered urgently, "and the backup generator should have kicked in automatically." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "He's here." In the sudden darkness, Layla rose to her feet, a low growl rumbling in her chest as she faced the direction of the perimeter fence. James placed a hand on Elena's arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. "Now we will see whether your science or my traditions offer the better protection for Tohill," he said quietly. "But I suspect we will need both before this night is over." In the sudden darkness, Elena's training took over. She pulled a small flashlight from her pocket, its beam cutting through the blackness like a knife. "Marco, check the emergency protocols. I'll call Vasquez." Marco nodded, his own flashlight already in hand as he moved toward the main building. Elena turned to James, who stood unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on Layla's enclosure. The bobcat was fully alert now, her body low to the ground in a hunting posture, focused on something beyond their field of vision. "Mr. Antone, I need you to go inside where it's safer," Elena said, already dialing on her phone. James shook his head. My place is here with Tohil. The cycle must be honored even in times of danger. Before Elena could argue, her call to Agent Vasquez connected. Power's out at the sanctuary, she said tersely. Security system's down too. I think Whitaker's making his move. I've got a unit 5 minutes out, Vasquez replied, her voice crisp with professional urgency. Can you secure the Bobcat? Elena glanced at the enclosure. In the dim starlight, she could just make out Layla's form, still alert and focused on the perimeter. We're with her now. I'll update you when your unit arrives. She ended the call and turned back to James. Help is coming. It may not arrive in time, James replied calmly. Listen. Elena held her breath, straining her ears against the night. Then she heard it. The faint snip of metal cutters working through chain-link fence, somewhere beyond the Bobcat enclosures. He's cutting through the north fence, she whispered, her mind racing through options. The sanctuary's tranquilizer gun was with Marco, who had headed in the opposite direction. The nearest landline phone was in the main building. And Layla's enclosure, while secure, wasn't designed to withstand a determined intruder with proper tools. James placed a weathered hand on her arm. There is another way to protect her, if you trust me. Elena hesitated only a moment before nodding. Scientific skepticism aside, James's presence and knowledge of the situation before it unfolded had earned him a measure of credibility. What do we do? Open her enclosure, James said simply. Elena stared at him in disbelief. Release her? That's completely against protocol. She's not ready. Tohil has survived in these deserts her entire life, James interrupted gently. The cage you think protects her now makes her vulnerable. In freedom, she will find safety. The sound of metal snipping grew louder, now accompanied by the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Whoever was approaching wasn't bothering with stealth anymore, confident that the disabled security system had given them the advantage. Elena made her decision. Stay here, she whispered to James before moving swiftly to the enclosure's service entrance. Every fiber of her professional training screamed against what she was about to do, but something deeper, an intuition she couldn't explain, pushed her forward. The enclosure was secured with a padlock, the key to which hung on her belt alongside her ID badge. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and eased it open just wide enough for a Bobcat to pass through. Then she retreated, moving back to where James stood. Now what? She whispered. Now we wait, James replied, his eyes never leaving Layla. The choice must be hers. Inside the enclosure, Layla had noticed the open door. Her keen senses had already detected the human intruder approaching from the north, bringing with him scents of metal, chemicals, and the lingering traces of other animals, prey and predators alike. The Bobcat's instincts screamed danger, yet she remained hesitant at the threshold of freedom, her golden eyes flicking between the open door and the humans who had cared for her. Rex Whitaker moved through the sanctuary grounds with practiced efficiency, his night vision goggles giving him a distinct advantage in the darkness. The wire cutters had made short work of the perimeter fence, and the signal jammer in his backpack had successfully disabled both the power and the backup generator. Years of similar operations had taught him to be thorough. He carried a specialized animal transport carrier in one hand and a pneumatic tranquilizer pistol in the other, smaller and more precise than the bulky rifles wildlife officials typically used. His buyers had been explicit. The Bobcat needed to be unharmed, its spirit unbroken. A difficult requirement in the best of circumstances, nearly impossible given the time constraints he now faced. As he approached the outdoor enclosures, Rex paused, sensing that something wasn't right. The area was too quiet. He had expected to find the Bobcat in an enclosure, probably hiding in one of the artificial dens typically provided in such facilities. Instead, he saw two figures standing motionless near what appeared to be an open cage door. "What the hell?" he muttered, adjusting his course to approach from a different angle. Through his goggles, he could make out the forms of a woman, likely the veterinarian he had observed earlier, and an elderly man he didn't recognize. Of the bobcat, there was no sign. Back at the enclosure, Elena held her breath as Layla finally moved toward the open door. The bobcat paused at the threshold, sniffing the air cautiously. Then, with decision made, she slipped through the opening and into the open sanctuary grounds, not fleeing as Elena had expected, but moving with purpose toward a cluster of desert plants about 30 feet from where they stood. "She's not running," Elena whispered in amazement. James nodded, a smile touching his lips. "Tohil understands more than you know. Watch now." Before Elena could respond, a beam of light cut through the darkness from the direction of the main building. Marco was returning, his flashlight bobbing as he jogged toward them. "Generator's been tampered with," he called out as he approached. "I've reset the—" He stopped abruptly, noticing the open enclosure door. "Elena, what have you done?" "It was necessary," she replied, keeping her voice low. "Whitaker's already inside the perimeter." Marco's expression shifted from shock to grim determination. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the tranquilizer pistol. "Where's Layla?" Elena pointed toward the cluster of plants where the bobcat had disappeared. As she did, a new sound reached them, the distinctive click of a weapon being readied coming from the shadows to their left. "Nobody move." Rex Whitaker's voice carried the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. He stepped into view, his night vision goggles giving him an otherworldly appearance in the darkness. In his hand, a pistol gleamed dully in the starlight. Not a tranquilizer gun, but a real firearm. "All I want is the bobcat," he continued, sweeping his gaze across the three figures before him. "Tell me where it went, and we can all pretend this never happened." Marco tensed, the tranquilizer gun now hidden behind his leg. Elena stepped forward slightly, instinctively placing herself between Rex and the direction Layla had gone. "The bobcat is a federally protected species," she said, striving to keep her voice steady. "Taking her would be a felony offense." Rex chuckled, the sound entirely without humor. "Lady, I'm way past worrying about felonies. Now, last chance. Where is the cat?" James, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to command the night itself. "She is where she needs to be, fulfilling what was written long before any of us walked this earth." Rex turned toward him, irritation flashing across his features. "Who the hell are you, old man? Some kind of tribal shaman? Save it for the tourists." He raised his pistol, pointing it directly at James. "I've got buyers waiting who paid good money for a specific ritual. They need that bobcat tonight, and I'm not leaving without it." The standoff stretched into seconds of tense silence, broken only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. Relief flooded through Elena at the sound. Vasquez's promised backup was finally arriving. But Rex heard it too, his expression hardening as he realized his window of opportunity was closing. "Damn it!" he snarled, taking a menacing step forward. "I don't have time for this. Tell me where the cat is now, or—" A blur of motion erupted from the darkness behind him. Layla, moving with the silent precision that made bobcats such effective hunters, launched herself at Rex's back. Though half the size of a mountain lion, her compact strength and perfect timing sent the man staggering forward, the gun flying from his hand as he struggled to maintain his balance. "What the—" Rex's curse was cut short as he tumbled to the ground, the night vision goggles wrenched askew by the impact. Layla was already gone, disappearing back into the darkness with the same fluid grace that had marked her attack. Marco didn't hesitate. In the moment of confusion, he raised the tranquilizer pistol and fired, the dart finding its mark in Rex's thigh even as the man scrambled to his feet. The fast-acting sedative would take only seconds to begin working, but those seconds could still prove dangerous. Rex swayed on his feet, the tranquilizer already coursing through his system. His hand groped blindly for the gun that now lay somewhere in the darkness, his movements growing increasingly uncoordinated. "You don't understand," he slurred, struggling to focus on the three figures before him. "Those people, they won't take no for an answer." Elena stepped forward cautiously, keeping a safe distance as Rex dropped to his knees, fighting the sedative's effects. "It's over, Whitaker. The authorities are almost here." "Never over," Rex mumbled, his eyes rolling back as the tranquilizer finally overcame his resistance. He slumped to the ground, unconscious but breathing steadily. Marco moved quickly to secure the fallen gun, ejecting its magazine and clearing the chamber with practiced hands. "Military grade," he noted grimly. He wasn't playing around. The wail of sirens grew louder, now accompanied by the sweep of headlights as vehicles approached the sanctuary entrance. Elena released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation beginning to ebb. "We need to find Layla," she said, turning to scan the sanctuary grounds. The Bobcat had vanished as quickly as she had appeared, leaving no trace of her presence save for the scratches on Rex's jacket. James had remained remarkably calm throughout the encounter, his weathered face betraying no fear even when Rex had pointed the gun at him. Now he turned to Elena with the same serene expression. "Tohill is safe. She has done what was needed." "But we can't just leave her loose in the sanctuary," Elena protested. "She's still recovering, and once the police secure the perimeter, we need to—" She was interrupted by the arrival of Agent Vasquez, who burst through the gate accompanied by two uniformed officers, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. "Rodriguez," Vasquez called out, spotting Elena immediately. "Are you all right? We got reports of shots fired." "We're fine," Elena replied, gesturing toward Rex's unconscious form. Marco tranquilized him before he could use his weapon. "That's Rex Whitaker. He cut through the perimeter fence and disabled our security system." Vasquez directed the officers to secure the suspect, her expression grim but satisfied as she recognized the man she'd been building a case against for years. "Caught in the act, finally. Where's the Bobcat?" Elena hesitated, knowing how Vasquez would react to the news that they had released Layla. "She's on the grounds. We had to open her enclosure when Whitaker arrived." Vasquez's expression shifted from satisfaction to alarm. "You released a Bobcat under rehabilitation into the sanctuary. Rodriguez, that's completely against protocol. We need to find and secure that animal immediately." "Agent Vasquez," James stepped forward, extending his hand. "I am James Antone. The decision to release the Bobcat was made on my recommendation, and I take full responsibility." Vasquez eyed him suspiciously, shaking his hand briefly. "And you are involved in this situation? How, exactly?" While James calmly explained his connection to Layla and his arrival at the sanctuary that evening, Elena's attention was drawn to a movement in the shadows beyond the officer's flashlight beams. There, just visible in the starlight, Layla sat watching the proceedings with unnerving stillness, her golden eyes reflecting the distant lights. Elena nudged Marco and subtly nodded toward the Bobcat. His eyes widened in surprise, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod, understanding her silent message not to draw attention to Layla's presence just yet. Vasquez was skeptical of James's explanation, her law enforcement training evident in her pointed questions and dubious expressions. "So you're telling me this specific Bobcat has some kind of spiritual significance to your tribe, and that's why you came here tonight? Just as Whitaker happened to make his move?" "I came because I knew she was in danger," James replied simply. "The timing was not coincidence, but neither was it planned. Some patterns exist beyond our usual understanding." Vasquez looked like she wanted to pursue this line of questioning further, but professional priorities won out. We'll discuss this later. Right now, we need to secure the Bobcat before she leaves the sanctuary grounds or injures herself. Dr. Rodriguez, what's the safest way to recapture her? Elena glanced again to where Layla had been sitting, but the Bobcat had vanished once more into the darkness. We should set up a perimeter and use standard wildlife recovery protocols. But, Agent Vasquez, I should mention that Layla, the Bobcat, displayed some unusual behavior tonight. She actually attacked Whitaker when he threatened us, then disappeared. Attacked him? Vasquez's eyebrows rose. That's not typical for a Bobcat in rehabilitation. No, Elena agreed, it's not. She's been unusual from the beginning. While they discussed recovery strategies, the officers handcuffed the still unconscious Rex and began documenting the scene. One officer discovered the animal transport carrier and tranquilizer gun Rex had brought, photographing them as evidence. We've got a bigger problem, Vasquez said, lowering her voice. Whitaker didn't operate alone. My sources indicate he was working for some wealthy collectors from back east, people with resources and connections. If they've already paid for this Bobcat for whatever ceremony they have planned, they might not give up so easily. Marco frowned. You think they'll send someone else? It's a possibility we need to consider, Vasquez confirmed. Which makes finding the Bobcat even more urgent. I'm calling in additional units to secure the sanctuary until we can locate her. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the sanctuary transformed into a hub of activity. Additional agents arrived, along with local police officers and a forensic team, to process the evidence from Rex's break-in. The power and security systems were restored, casting harsh artificial light across grounds that had been shrouded in darkness just hours before. Through it all, there was no sign of Layla. Teams conducted methodical searches of the sanctuary, checking every potential hiding place, but the Bobcat had vanished as completely as if she had never been there at all. Elena, exhausted but unable to rest until Layla was found, joined James on a bench outside the main building. The elderly man seemed entirely untroubled by the commotion around them or the Bobcat's disappearance. You don't seem worried about her, Elena observed, rubbing her tired eyes. James smiled, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the desert landscape. Toe Hill is exactly where she needs to be. The cycle continues as it should. But she's still recovering, Elena insisted. Her old injury, the dehydration, she's not ready to be completely on her own yet. Dr. Rodriguez, James said gently, you see her through the lens of your science, as a patient, an animal in need of care. I see her through the lens of my traditions, as a messenger, a being with purpose beyond our human understanding. Perhaps both perspectives hold truth. Elena was about to respond when Marco approached, his expression a mixture of confusion and excitement. Elena, you need to see this. We found something at the perimeter fence, the north side where it was cut. Curious despite her fatigue, Elena followed Marco to the breach in the fence where Rex had entered hours earlier. Agent Vasquez was already there, crouched beside something on the ground, her expression unreadable. As Elena drew closer, she saw what had captured everyone's attention. A dead rattlesnake lay just inside the cut fence, its body still coiled but its head crushed by what appeared to be the precise bite of a predator. Beside it lay Rex's night vision goggles, cracked and useless. It's a western diamondback, Marco said unnecessarily, his background in wildlife biology coming to the fore. Adult male, probably displaced by the recent development north of here. You're saying the Bobcat killed it? Vasquez asked, looking up at Elena. It's possible, Elena replied hesitantly. Bobcats do occasionally prey on rattlesnakes, though it's not common. They're more likely to avoid them. James had followed them to the scene, and now he gazed at the dead snake with knowing eyes. In our stories, Tohil is not just a messenger, but a protector. The serpent represents the danger that would have followed, even after the man was taken away. "What do you mean?" Vasquez asked sharply. "The goggles," James pointed. "They contain a tracking device, do they not? A way for others to find this place, to continue what was started." Vasquez immediately grabbed a plastic evidence bag from one of the forensic technicians and carefully placed the goggles inside. "We'll have the tech team analyze these right away," she said, her expression grim. "If there is a tracker, it could lead Whitaker's associates right to us." As if to emphasize her point, the distant sound of a helicopter broke the morning stillness, growing steadily louder as it approached from the east. All eyes turned skyward as the aircraft appeared over the ridge, hovering momentarily above the sanctuary before banking sharply and heading north. "That's not one of ours," Vasquez muttered, pulling out her radio to check with dispatch. After a brief exchange, she turned to Elena and Marco, her expression tense. "Unregistered flight path. No identification markings visible from the ground. I don't like this." Elena felt a chill despite the warming morning air. "You think it's connected to Whitaker?" "Too much of a coincidence otherwise," Vasquez replied. "We need to accelerate the evidence collection and get Whitaker into secure holding for questioning. And we need to find that Bobcat before anyone else does." The sanctuary grounds were now bathed in the golden light of early morning, revealing details that had been hidden in the darkness. Teams of officers continued their methodical search for Layla, checking every corner of the 20-acre property. Elena joined one of the search parties, her expertise in wildlife behavior making her a valuable asset despite her exhaustion. Marco, meanwhile, worked with the sanctuary's maintenance staff to repair the damaged fence and restore all security systems to full functionality. The tranquilized Rex Whitaker had been transported to a secure medical facility where he would remain under guard until he was stable enough for formal booking and questioning. Through it all, James Antone maintained his serene demeanor, politely answering Vasquez's increasingly pointed questions about his presence at the sanctuary and his knowledge of the events that had unfolded. He revealed little beyond what he had already shared, his responses both cooperative and somehow evasive in a way that clearly frustrated the federal agent. By mid-morning, with the search still yielding no sign of Layla, Elena returned to her office to review the Bobcat's medical records. If Layla had indeed left the sanctuary grounds, a possibility that seemed increasingly likely, Elena needed to assess how the animal's health might be affected by a premature return to the wild. She was surprised to find James waiting for her, seated calmly in the chair opposite her desk. "Agent Vasquez finished her questions?" Elena asked, sinking tiredly into her chair. James nodded. "For now, she is a dedicated protector in her own way." Elena smiled faintly at this diplomatic characterization of Vasquez's intense interrogation style. "She's good at her job." She gestured to the files spread across her desk. "I'm trying to determine if Layla, Tohil, can survive out there. Her old injury had healed well, but she was still underweight, still recovering from the dehydration." "You care deeply for her," James observed. "I care for all the animals that come through here," Elena replied, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. There was something special about Layla, something that had connected with her from the moment they had found her in the trap. "May I show you something, Dr. Rodriguez?" James asked, rising from his chair. "Something that might ease your mind about Tohil's fate?" Curious despite her fatigue, Elena nodded and followed James outside. They walked in companionable silence past the main enclosures toward the eastern edge of the sanctuary property, where the manicured grounds gave way to natural desert landscape. James moved with the unhurried confidence of someone intimately familiar with the terrain, despite having never visited the sanctuary before last night. They stopped at a small rise overlooking a dry wash that marked the property boundary. From this vantage point, they could see for miles across the desert, the mountains rising blue and distant on the horizon. "Look there," James said quietly, pointing to a cluster of mesquite trees about a quarter-mile beyond the sanctuary fence. Elena squinted against the sunlight, seeing nothing at first. Then a movement caught her eye, the distinctive shape of a bobcat moving with fluid grace between the trees. Even at this distance, she could recognize Layla's distinctive gait, slightly favoring her right front paw. "She made it out," Elena whispered, a mixture of professional concern and awe in her voice. "But how did she get past the fence? We've checked the entire perimeter." James smiled. "Tohill knows ways that we do not. The old ones say that when necessary, she can walk between worlds." Elena would normally have dismissed such a statement as mystical nonsense, but after the events of the past 24 hours, her certainty in the rational world had been somewhat shaken. Instead, she simply watched as Layla paused in her journey, seeming to look back directly at them before disappearing into the deeper desert. "She'll be okay out there?" Elena asked, surprising herself with the question. She was the wildlife expert after all. "She was born to this desert," James replied, "and she has a purpose to fulfill. Yes, Dr. Rodriguez, she will be okay." As they turned to head back to the sanctuary buildings, Elena noticed a small object on the ground where they had been standing. A single feather, striped in patterns of brown and white. She bent to pick it up. "A red-tailed hawk feather," James identified it. "In our traditions, the hawk is a messenger between earth and sky, a bearer of perspective." Elena carefully tucked the feather into her pocket, oddly moved by the small token. As they walked back, a convoy of black SUVs passed them on the sanctuary's main drive, heading toward the administration building. "Looks like we have more visitors," Elena remarked, quickening her pace. They arrived to find the sanctuary's small parking area filled with vehicles, including the unmarked SUVs and a sleek private helicopter now parked in the adjacent field. Agent Vasquez stood on the steps of the main building, engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 60s, flanked by two younger men whose stiff postures and alert eyes marked them as security personnel. Marco intercepted Elena and James before they could approach. "That's Lawrence Chamberlain," he said in a low voice, CEO of Chamberlain Investments and apparently Rex Whitaker's primary client. "The buyer?" Elena asked, watching the exchange on the steps with growing concern. "Seems so. He showed up with lawyers and private security, demanding to speak with whoever's in charge of the missing property, as he put it." "The Bobcat is not property," Elena said sharply. "Try telling him that," Marco replied grimly. "Vasquez is holding her ground so far, but this guy has some serious political connections. He's already on the phone with the regional director." James had been listening quietly, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Now he straightened his shoulders and stepped forward. "I should speak with him." Elena caught his arm. "Mr. Antone, I'm not sure that's a good idea. This man is clearly powerful and not accustomed to being denied what he wants." James smiled gently. "Some powers are older and deeper than wealth or political connections, Dr. Rodriguez. Sometimes the oldest stories need to be told again to those who have forgotten them." Before Elena could protest further, James walked calmly toward the confrontation on the steps. As he approached, Chamberlain broke off his conversation with Vasquez, his imperious gaze falling on the elderly man with visible disdain. "And who might you be?" Chamberlain asked, his cultured voice carrying the unmistakable edge of someone accustomed to deference. "I am James Antone," came the simple reply. "And I believe we need to discuss your interest in the one my people call Tohill, the Firebringer." Chamberlain's expression flickered with surprise before settling back into calculated neutrality. You know of the ceremony, then? James nodded. I know of a ceremony, yes. But I suspect what you seek is not what you understand. A tense silence fell over the gathering, broken only by the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling high above the desert. In that moment, standing between the powerful businessman and the federal agent, James Antone seemed to Elena to embody something timeless and unshakable, a connection to the land that transcended the human dramas playing out upon it. Lawrence Chamberlain's eyes narrowed as he studied James, reassessing the elderly man who had interrupted his conversation with Agent Vasquez. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private, he suggested, his tone making it clear this was not actually a request. I have no secrets to hide, James replied calmly. Whatever you wish to say can be said here, in the open air, where the desert itself bears witness. Chamberlain's jaw tightened momentarily before he regained his composure. With a dismissive gesture, he sent his security personnel back to the vehicles, though they remained within easy calling distance. Very well, Mr. Antone, you claim to know about the ceremony. What exactly do you think you understand about matters that have been researched and authenticated by experts in ancient traditions? James's expression remained serene, undisturbed by Chamberlain's condescension. I understand that for generations, my people have carried the stories of Tohil, the bobcat who bears the mark of the messenger. I understand that these stories speak of harmony and balance, not sacrifice and power. Ancient traditions evolve and are reinterpreted, Chamberlain countered smoothly. My interest in this particular specimen is purely academic and spiritual. The ceremony I've invested in researching is based on texts dating back centuries. Texts written by those who observed from outside, who saw the surface but not the heart, James replied. The true meaning passes through the spoken word, from elder to child, in the language of the people. Elena and Marco had moved closer, standing now just behind James. Agent Vasquez remained on the steps, her professional demeanor intact, but her attention entirely focused on the exchange. Mr. Chamberlain, Elena interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. Whatever ceremony you're planning, it would involve harming a protected species. That's a federal offense, regardless of any cultural or spiritual justification. Chamberlain turned his attention to Elena, his smile not reaching his eyes. Dr. Rodriguez, I presume. Let me assure you, my interest is not in harming the animal. The ceremony requires its presence, its essence, but not its destruction. I'm a conservationist myself, with substantial donations to wildlife protection organizations across 3 continents. Yet you hired a known wildlife trafficker to trap and steal a bobcat under rehabilitation, Vasquez pointed out, her voice sharp with accusation. I hired a wildlife procurement specialist to ethically obtain a specific specimen for a controlled, documented ceremony that would have advanced our understanding of pre-Columbian spiritual practices, Chamberlain corrected. If Mr. Whitaker's methods were less than ideal, that falls on him, not me. I was assured all necessary permits and exceptions would be arranged. James shook his head slowly. You speak of understanding, yet you seek to take Tohil from her home, to use her for purposes that serve only human curiosity and ambition. This is not the way of the stories. Something in James's tone seemed to penetrate Chamberlain's practiced facade. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his features. The text specifically mentions a bobcat with a distinctive marking, a figure 8 pattern on the left flank. This exact marking has appeared only 3 times in documented wildlife records over the past century. When my researchers discovered one had been reported in this region, I knew the opportunity was unique. And what does your text say this ceremony would accomplish? James asked. Chamberlain hesitated, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. It speaks of a gateway between worlds, a transfer of power from the messenger to those who complete the ritual. Ancient wisdom accessible to those who prove worthy. A sad smile touched James's lips. And there is the misunderstanding that has persisted for generations. Tohil does not give power to humans who capture her. She carries warnings and guidance for those wise enough to observe and respect her freedom. While this conversation unfolded, Elena noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The morning had been clear and calm, but now a wind was rising from the east, carrying with it the scent of rain, unusual for this time of year. Dark clouds had begun to gather over the distant mountains, their shadows racing across the desert floor toward the sanctuary. "A storm is coming," she murmured to Marco, who nodded, his eyes on the rapidly changing sky. "Not typical weather for this season," he replied quietly. "Forecast didn't mention anything about precipitation today." James seemed aware of the shifting weather as well, his eyes briefly turning to the approaching clouds before focusing again on Chamberlain. "You sought Tohil for a ceremony of power, but her true purpose is to herald change. The stories say that when the Firebringer appears, she brings warning of imbalance between the human world and the natural one." Chamberlain's expression hardened. "Mr. Antone, while I respect your cultural heritage, I've invested considerable resources in this project. The text I possess was translated from original source material by scholars with decades of expertise in pre-Columbian languages and traditions. I find it difficult to believe that oral stories passed down through generations would be more accurate than documented historical records." "History is written by those who hold the pen," James replied simply, "not by those who hold the truth." The wind had strengthened now, whipping dust across the sanctuary grounds. The security personnel by the vehicles looked up anxiously at the darkening sky, and several of the sanctuary staff had emerged from the buildings to watch the unusual weather pattern developing. Agent Vasquez stepped forward, her professional focus cutting through the philosophical debate. "Mr. Chamberlain, regardless of the academic or spiritual justification, the fact remains that you contracted someone to illegally obtain a protected species. We have evidence linking you directly to Whitaker, including financial transactions and communications that specify the Bobcat acquisition." Chamberlain's lawyer, who had remained silent until now, touched his client's arm in warning. Chamberlain ignored him, his attention still fixed on James. The ceremony was scheduled for tonight, the last night when the alignment would be perfect according to the text. If the Bobcat is truly gone, then perhaps this discussion is academic anyway. His tone suggested he didn't believe this was the case. "She is beyond your reach now," James confirmed. "Tohil has returned to the desert to fulfill her true purpose." A flash of genuine anger crossed Chamberlain's face. "Do you have any idea what you've interfered with? This ceremony occurs once in a generation. The knowledge it could have revealed was never meant for those who would take it by force," James interrupted gently. "Some wisdom comes only to those who observe and respect, not to those who capture and control." The first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and warm on the dust-dry ground. The scent of wet creosote and sage rose from the desert, a sweet, pungent aroma that signaled the rare blessing of summer rain. Within moments, the scattered drops became a steady downpour, sending everyone rushing for the shelter of the main building. Everyone except James, who remained where he stood, face turned up to the rain, seemingly unbothered by the drenching he was receiving. Elena hesitated at the building's entrance, watching him with a mixture of concern and fascination. "Mr. Antone," she called, "you should come inside." James lowered his gaze to meet hers, rain streaming down his weathered face. "The desert drinks deeply when water comes," he replied, "as should we all when wisdom flows freely." Inside the building, tension crackled like static electricity as Chamberlain conferred with his lawyer and security team in low, urgent tones. Agent Vasquez had stepped away to take a call, but her posture suggested the conversation was not going well. "What's happening?" Elena asked Marco, who had been standing near enough to overhear some of Vasquez's call. "Whitaker's talking," Marco replied quietly. "But the regional director is apparently getting pressure from someone high up to handle this discreetly. Political connections at work." Elena felt a surge of frustration. So Chamberlain might actually get away with this? "Not if Vasquez has anything to say about it," Marco assured her, "but it's complicated now, and something tells me it's about to get even more complicated." As if in answer to his prediction, the lights in the building flickered once, twice, then went out completely as a tremendous crack of thunder shook the very foundation beneath their feet. Through the windows, they could see that what had started as an unusual rain shower had transformed into something far more dramatic, a full desert thunderstorm of extraordinary intensity. Emergency lights flickered on, casting the sanctuary's main building in an eerie amber glow. Outside, the storm raged with an intensity that seemed almost deliberate in its fury. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets driven by winds that howled around the building's corners. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. "This isn't normal," Marco murmured, standing beside Elena at the window. "Even for a monsoon season storm, this is extreme." Elena nodded, her eyes searching the rain-swept grounds for James. The elderly man had finally sought shelter, but instead of joining them in the main building, he had disappeared into one of the smaller outbuildings used for wildlife rehabilitation supplies. "Where's Antone?" Chamberlain demanded, approaching them with barely contained agitation. His perfectly tailored suit now looked rumpled, his commanding presence somewhat diminished by the elemental chaos outside. "Not your concern," Elena replied coolly, turning to face him. The more she learned about this man and his intentions for Layla, the less she felt inclined toward professional courtesy. Chamberlain's expression hardened. "I think you fail to grasp the significance of what's happening here, Dr. Rodriguez. This storm," he gestured toward the window, "is not coincidental. The text describes atmospheric phenomena accompanying the ceremony, specifically when the messenger is about to fulfill its purpose." "Her purpose," Elena corrected automatically, "and according to Mr. Antone, that purpose isn't what you think it is." "Folklore and superstition," Chamberlain dismissed with a wave of his hand, though something in his eyes suggested he wasn't as confident as he pretended. "The text is explicit about the power transfer ritual and its requirements." Agent Vasquez rejoined them, slipping her phone into her pocket with a grim expression. "Mr. Chamberlain, regardless of your interpretation of ancient texts, I have just received authorization to detain you for questioning regarding your involvement in wildlife trafficking. Your lawyer is welcome to accompany us to our field office once the storm abates." Chamberlain's facade of cultured civility cracked. "This is absurd. I have associates in Washington who will—" "Who will what, Mr. Chamberlain?" Vasquez interrupted coolly. "Interfere with a federal investigation? That would only compound the legal issues you're facing." Before Chamberlain could respond, the building's door flew open with a gust of wind and rain. James Antone stood in the doorway, somehow looking more substantial than he had before, as if the storm had infused him with new vitality despite his advanced years. "It's time," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the howl of the wind. "Toe Hill calls for witnesses." "What are you talking about?" Chamberlain demanded, but James had already turned and walked back into the storm, seemingly impervious to the driving rain. Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed her rain jacket from a hook by the door and followed James into the deluge. Behind her, she heard Marco curse softly before following suit. After a moment's hesitation, Vasquez did the same, leaving Chamberlain and his entourage to decide whether to remain in the relative safety of the building or join the procession into the storm. The rain was warm but fierce, soaking through Elena's jacket within seconds. She followed James's form ahead of her, barely visible through the curtain of water that seemed to envelop the world. To her surprise, he was heading toward the eastern boundary of the sanctuary, the same direction where they had glimpsed Layla earlier that morning. "Where are we going?" she called out, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the storm. James didn't answer, but continued his steady pace across the grounds, his feet finding secure purchase on the increasingly muddy terrain as if he could see a path invisible to others. Elena struggled to keep up, aware of Marco and Vasquez behind her, and further back the sound of additional footsteps suggesting that curiosity had overcome caution for Chamberlain and at least some of his group. They reached the rise where Elena and James had stood that morning, overlooking the wash that marked the sanctuary's boundary. The desert beyond was transformed by the downpour, dry arroyos now churning with muddy water, creosote bushes bending under the weight of the rain. Lightning continued to flash across the sky, illuminating the landscape in stroboscopic bursts that made the familiar terrain seem alien and mysterious. James stopped at the crest of the rise, raising his hand to point toward the cluster of mesquite trees where they had last seen Layla. "There," he said simply. "Watch." Elena wiped rain from her eyes, straining to see through the storm. At first, there was nothing but the blur of rain and the thrashing of vegetation in the wind. Then, in a flash of lightning, she saw it, movement among the trees, not just one form but several. As her eyes adjusted, the shapes became clearer, bobcats, at least half a dozen of them, gathering in a loose circle in the relatively sheltered space beneath the largest mesquite. "That's impossible," Marco whispered beside her. "Bobcats are solitary animals. They don't congregate like this." "They do when Tohill calls," James replied calmly. "Once in a generation, when the messenger appears, the scattered children of the desert come together to hear what must be heard." Another figure had joined them on the rise, Chamberlain, his expensive shoes sinking into the mud, his hair plastered to his skull by the relentless rain. His eyes widened as he took in the gathering of bobcats below. "The convergence," he breathed, an almost religious awe in his voice. "The text mentions this, but no observer has documented it in centuries. Because it was never meant to be observed by those who would exploit it," James said, his voice carrying a note of sadness. "What you see is sacred, not because it grants power to humans, but because it renews the covenant between the wild and the land that sustains it." As they watched, transfixed, another flash of lightning revealed Layla moving to the center of the gathering. Even at this distance, her distinctive markings were visible, seeming almost to glow against her spotted coat. The other bobcats formed a perfect circle around her, their usual territorial aggression nowhere in evidence. "What are they doing?" Elena asked, her scientific skepticism increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of what she was witnessing. "They are listening," James replied. "Tohill brings warning of changes to come. Drought, fire, flood. The marked one senses what others cannot, carries knowledge that must be shared so the wild ones can prepare." Chamberlain had moved closer, his expression a complex mixture of wonder, frustration, and dawning understanding. "The text got it wrong," he said almost to himself. "Or I did. It's not about transferring power to humans at all, is it?" "No," James confirmed. "It never was. The ceremony you sought to capture and control is not meant for human benefit. It is for the continuation of life in balance, a communication among species that share the land but speak different languages." As if to punctuate his words, a final massive lightning bolt struck the ground near the gathered bobcats, so close that Elena instinctively flinched away from its brilliance. When she looked back, blinking away the afterimage, the scene below had changed. The bobcats were dispersing, melting away into the desert in different directions, with the fluid grace characteristic of their kind. Only Layla remained, standing perfectly still in the center of where the circle had been, her golden eyes seeming to look directly up at the humans watching from the rise. "She sees us," Elena whispered. "She has always seen us," James replied. The question was whether we would truly see her. As suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to subside. The driving rain softened to a gentle shower, then to scattered drops, and finally ceased altogether. The wind that had howled with such fury now whispered through the wet vegetation, carrying the sweet scent of rain-soaked desert soil. Above them, the clouds parted, allowing shafts of sunlight to illuminate the transformed landscape in patches of gold against the lingering shadows. No one spoke for several long moments, each processing what they had witnessed in their own way. Elena felt as though some fundamental shift had occurred in her understanding of the world, as if a veil had been lifted revealing connections and patterns she had always sensed but never fully acknowledged despite her scientific training. Chamberlain was the first to break the silence. 20 years, he said, his voice subdued, almost reverent. I've spent 20 years researching the text, acquiring artifacts, searching for the markers described. He turned to James, the arrogance gone from his bearing. And I never understood it until now. James nodded, his expression compassionate rather than triumphant. Knowledge without wisdom is like a vessel without water. It has the form, but not the substance that gives it purpose. Below them, Layla remained where the other Bobcats had left her, watching the humans on the rise with unblinking golden eyes. Then, with deliberate slowness, she began to move toward them, climbing the slope with the measured pace of one who has made a decision after careful consideration. "She's coming here," Marco whispered, instinctively reaching for the tranquilizer gun that wasn't there. "Let her come," James said. "She has something to show us." Elena held her breath as Layla approached, stopping about 15 feet away, close enough for clear observation, but maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged the boundary between wild and human. The Bobcat sat, her tail curled neatly around her paws, and simply regarded them with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold knowledge beyond human comprehension. Agent Vasquez had maintained professional composure throughout the extraordinary events, but now even she seemed moved by the Bobcat's deliberate approach. "In 15 years of wildlife law enforcement, I've never seen anything like this," she admitted quietly. Layla rose again and took several steps closer to Chamberlain specifically, stopping just beyond arm's reach. The businessman stood perfectly still, tension evident in every line of his body, as the wild predator fixed him with its unblinking gaze. "She's challenging you," James explained softly. "Not physically, but spiritually. What will you do with what you have witnessed today?" Chamberlain swallowed hard, his carefully constructed worldview visibly crumbling in the face of an experience that defied his expectations. "I sought power," he admitted, "knowledge that would elevate me above others. I thought that was the purpose of wisdom. And now," James prompted gently, "now I understand that true wisdom isn't possessed, it's participated in." Chamberlain slowly knelt in the mud, bringing himself to eye level with Layla. The ceremony was never about human gain at all. It was about bearing witness, being humble enough to listen. As if satisfied with this acknowledgement, Layla blinked slowly, then turned and began making her way back down the slope toward the desert beyond. Before she had gone far, she paused and looked back, not at Chamberlain this time, but at Elena. "She's waiting for you," James said. "There is one more thing to be understood." Heart pounding, Elena carefully made her way down the slope until she stood just a few feet from Layla. The Bobcat regarded her with what Elena could only interpret as recognition, not just as a human who had provided care, but as another being with whom something important must be shared. Layla turned her head deliberately toward the distant mountains, then back to Elena, repeating the gesture with unmistakable purpose. "I think she's trying to tell you something about the mountains," Marco suggested from behind her. Elena studied the direction Layla was indicating. "The watershed," she realized suddenly. "That's where the new development project is planned, the one that would divert water from 3 major arroyos." James nodded. "The Firebringer warns of drought to come. If the waters are further diverted by human hands, the balance will be broken beyond repair." Layla held Elena's gaze for a moment longer, then turned and loped away, her form soon lost among the desert vegetation still dripping with rainwater. This time, there was a finality to her departure, a sense that her message had been delivered and her purpose fulfilled. As they made their way back to the sanctuary buildings, the group walked in thoughtful silence, each contemplating the implications of what they had witnessed. The storm had left its mark on the sanctuary, branches down, small structures damaged, but nothing that couldn't be repaired with time and effort. In the parking area, Chamberlain's security team waited anxiously by their vehicles, clearly relieved to see their employer return unharmed, if somewhat transformed by his experience. Agent Vasquez hung back, allowing Chamberlain a moment with James before the legal proceedings would necessarily begin. "What happens now?" Chamberlain asked the elderly man, genuine humility in his voice. "You have a choice," James replied. "You can return to your old understanding, dismiss what you've seen as an aberration or hallucination brought on by the storm. Many would. Or you can accept that the world is broader and deeper than your studies have led you to believe, and consider what responsibility such knowledge brings." Chamberlain was silent for a long moment. "The development project in the watershed," he said finally. "Chamberlain Investments is a major stakeholder." He straightened his shoulders. "I think perhaps our environmental impact studies have been insufficient." James smiled. "A beginning." Agent Vasquez stepped forward. "Mr. Chamberlain, I still need you to come with me to answer questions about your involvement with Whitaker." "I understand." Chamberlain nodded. "And I'll cooperate fully. There are aspects of this situation that need to be brought to light." He turned to his lawyer. "No obstructions, no delays. We answer for what we've done." As Chamberlain was escorted to Vasquez's vehicle, Elena found herself standing with James and Marco at the entrance to the sanctuary. The sun now shone brightly, steam rising from the rain-soaked ground in ethereal wisps that danced in the warming air. "Will we see her again?" Elena asked, knowing James would understand she meant Layla. "Tohill returns to the wild now, her purpose fulfilled for this generation," James replied. "But her offspring may one day bear the same marking when the time comes for the message to be carried once more." "And you?" Marco asked. "Where will you go?" James smiled, the lines in his weathered face deepening with genuine warmth. "Back to my home in the foothills. My part in this story is complete as well." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, which he pressed into Elena's hand. "To remember what you have witnessed." Elena opened her palm to find a small carved figure of a bobcat, made from a rich red stone that caught the sunlight like captured fire. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail rendered with loving precision. "It's beautiful," she breathed, "but I couldn't possibly." "It has waited many years for the right keeper," James interrupted gently. "As my grandmother gave it to me, I now give it to you, not as a possession, but as a reminder of the responsibility we share to maintain the balance between your world and the wild." In the weeks that followed, the Desert Wildlife Sanctuary gradually returned to its normal routines, though Elena felt that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Rex Whitaker faced multiple federal charges for wildlife trafficking and illegal possession of firearms. Lawrence Chamberlain, true to his word, cooperated with authorities and used his considerable resources to establish a conservation trust for the watershed area, permanently protecting it from development. The story of the Bobcat gathering during the storm became something of a legend among the sanctuary staff, though Elena was careful about how much she shared with the scientific community. Some experiences, she had come to believe, were meant to be honored through actions rather than publications. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Elena was checking trail cameras in the area where they had last seen Layla. The cameras were part of a new monitoring program she had established, studying wildlife movements around the protected watershed with minimal human interference. As she downloaded data from one of the units, a notification appeared on her tablet. Movement had been detected on another camera just minutes earlier. Elena opened the image and smiled. There, perfectly framed in the morning light, was Layla, healthy, strong, and unmistakable with her distinctive markings. And beside her, 3 small bobcat kittens, one of which bore a faint but recognizable figure-8 pattern on its left flank. "Hello, Towhill," Elena whispered to the image. "Your message continues." In her pocket, the small red stone carving seemed to warm slightly against her skin, a reminder of connections that science could observe but never fully explain. The delicate, essential balance between the world of humans and the wisdom of the wild.